Thank you, Mama Kama. Another round of applause for her, please. I think she does an amazing job of reminding us of the politics of language, where she starts off by saying to us, green resourcing is not terminology we use in the continent. She doesn't stop there. She says to us that just transition is more than energy transition. And it reminded me again of a conversation we had, it must have been at the second African Philanthropy Conference, shortly after Cyclone Idai, where Mama Machel challenged us to unpack what we meant by climate resilience. What does that term mean when we cannot name the harm that is done when women are holding on to their children who are being washed off by water, right? So that the importance of unpacking that. With that, I'd like to invite the next panelists to come and join us so we can continue this conversation. I'd like to invite Ikal, Angelei, who's from the, yes, please. Ikal is with Friends of Lake Turkana, and in rooms that she's not in, I have often described her as a universe in the sense that wherever she is, she does not forget where she comes from. She connects the struggles of indigenous peoples to environmental justice, to climate justice, financial inclusion, the right to development, and the right to say no. And it does not matter what room she's in. And in this conversation, she's going to be sharing with us the struggles around just energy transition. The next person that I'd like to invite is Melanie, Mela, you can call her Mela, Chiponda. Melanie is the director of the Shine Collaborative. And Mela is also one of the women in our region, and indeed in our continent, who have been on the front lines fighting for justice and expanding the fight for climate justice into really a reflection on how we push back on the social and ecological footprints of extractivist economies. Thank you, Mela, for joining us. Lastly, I'd like to invite a dear friend, James Murombedzi, to join us. James Murombedzi is the coordinator of the Africa Climate Policy Center at UNECA, and a friend who indeed, over a couple of decades, we've been having a conversation around what inclusive climate responses look like, and how we indeed, as Mama Kama said, center African humanity and African priorities in this space. When we were preparing for this, I thought that I would ask James to give us, the global governance framework first. But having listened to this really powerful keynote address from Mama Kama, I thought I would flip the script and start with people who are indeed living with and working on the front lines to share with us what the priorities are, what they are doing in their respective organizations, and what indeed has been highlighted by communities in the continent. And I'd like to invite Ikal first, and to ask you the question, how are the various formations you work with advancing Africa-centric climate responses and a vision for environmental resistance and sustainability? Over to you.
Thanks, Masego. First, I'm struggling with the AC. That's the first thing. I come from a place where it's 37, 38 degrees Celsius, so I have tried to move around the room every time, but it's crazy. So, I come from a pastoralist region, and my two sisters know that my first two fights were against renewable energy. So our first fight was a huge hydro dam. And for those who've been Mpandankua and others know the impact of big hydro dams on the local communities. And the second one is the largest wind farm in the continent, because in the process, Everybody is talking about the 1.5, everyone's talking about climate change globally and greenhouse gas emissions, but the local communities are talking about land for grazing, water, migration, their everyday struggles. And so at the local level, communities are asking the questions, you know, what's this? They don't have it. Which mother tongue has the word climate change? Anyone with a name in their local language for climate change? None. They'll tell you about the different seasons, how perhaps a different season has more rain than the other. And so we have been struggling with being able to take the local conversations and bring it to the global, the regional and the global periphery. And it is harder when people talk about, I was chatting with someone yesterday and talking about organizations with visibility. So the organizations that frame the narrative of resilience or climate are those who get into rooms and occupy the spaces. But then the local communities are not talking, they don't know yet how to coin the word climate, change, justice, energy. And most of them, as I think yesterday someone was saying, you know, is energy an enabler? Is it the only enabler to how people live their lives? Have you had people fighting for energy? Have you had people like going to war for energy? People go to war for land. They go to war for water. They go to war for food. There's no revolution on energy. There's never been a revolution that was started because the power, you know, what's it called? The one that's happening in South Africa. Power outages. You're not seeing a revolution. But today, if people are fighting about land that's been taken, people go to war. So what's really happening is there is a disconnect. And we all understand that we need to change, as Makoma said. But how are we changing, and who's defining how we change? And are the spaces able to allow the, as we said, the you are because I am, that the narrative of climate resilience, the narratives that are coined, what's going to be sexy tomorrow? Because we come up with sexy terminologies and everybody jumps with it. But here I have sisters here who've been fighting for ecological justice their whole lives. It was never coined as climate justice. They were fighting their whole lives for it. And so for us, at this level, we are basically saying, let's open up the conversation. Let's allow for a discussion that brings, the need to change, but how we change, but at the same time within our own parameters that don't take away our dignity. And the biggest part for us is that a question that I keep saying when people are talking about critical minerals. People have been mining copper. We knew the kwacha before we knew the dollar. We were learning about the kwacha before we knew there was a dollar or a yen. But right now we're talking about critical minerals. It's like it didn't happen. We have been mining in this continent. So how do we mine sustainably to meet our needs, but not their greed? And that's the place that we need to really center this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ikal. I think you give us an excellent segue to Mela, where you talk about the rush for energy transition and the pressure that it puts on the lands of indigenous peoples and local communities. But you also say these are not new questions. They're questions that connect to pre-existing struggles for land, for water, and for our lands not to be polluted. Mela, you spend a lot of time in a space that is dominated by the energy conversation. And with the work that Shine does, would you mind to share with us what the issues are and what the priorities are from the various formations that you work with?
Thank you very much, Masego. So from the work that Shine is doing, which actually comes from work that we have been doing with the sisters sitting here for a very, very long time, working on gender justice, working on climate justice, working on energy justice, but in the context of a development model that is extractivist in nature. And when we talk about extractivism, so many times we assume extractivism as something that happens only in the mineral sector. And yes, it happens in the mineral sector where we have very large corporations just extracting value from the land. But it is not only the minerals, it is the forests, where very large corporations are also extracting forest resources. And when I talk about forest resources, I think we have had some mention of carbon credits, and I just want to pass by that in the sense that when we talk about carbon markets, we are actually talking about a system that is saying we can keep polluting, but we make that pollution a cost of production. And therefore, let's create a market to sell greenhouse gas emissions, but we're not going to stop polluting. And the problem that I have with that is that when all these polluting corporations are buying credits and having forests, taking forests from communities for carbon sequestration, firstly, they are denying communities, indigenous peoples, our farmers, people living in rural jurisdictions of the use of their forest resources. Those forest resources are very critical within this ecological crisis that we are all in. And secondly, we are actually saying that whatever is being produced by this industry, what they are producing, they are going to add on this carbon, the cost of buying carbons to the cost of their whatever service or goods they are producing. And who is going to buy that? It is the people. And therefore, the people end up paying for the climate crisis, paying for people to continue polluting. And that we often, in our spaces, we call these false solutions. And these are solutions that are intended to make pollution, to make all these large corporations business as usual, that we continue business as usual, but let us come up with some scientific explanation. And I want to follow up after the previous keynote speaker who spoke about pseudoscientists and pseudoscience. And for me, whatever that research happened, I would call that also pseudoscience, because it is based on a claim which is not legitimate. And now let us go back to the work that SHINE is doing. SHINE comes from the divest, invest movement. We came from the movements where we had been saying, let us shut down the coal mines. And we are still saying that. Let us shut down all this oil extraction. Let us shut down the fossil fuels industry. Let us start questioning the fossil fuels driven development model. And we still say that. But as time went on, we had questions being asked about, so what, right? So what are we going to do? We shut that down. What is your solution? And that led us to think through what could be the solution that is not driven, firstly, from the conference rooms of NGOs or from boardrooms of large corporations, and not driven from the north, by the way, because we don't see the solution to the climate crisis as a one-size-fits-all in terms of the approach that we are going to use. And therefore, we start engaging with the movements where we had been. So what are we talking about here? What is a process that is just for us to move from this that we are challenging towards the future that we want to see, a future that is sustainable for the people and for the planet. And therefore, our work took us back again to the movements to start again building the knowledge that would lead us to where we want to get it. And let me just say, before I just round off this this part of the discussion, that it is often a space which is not funded, right? That when we look at the fights, when we look at the movements, when we look at yesterday, we had a discussion from a sister coming from Bikita where lithium is being mined. They don't have funding. They don't do log frames because there is no support for that. But these are the people who are saying, you know what, we are hoping that lithium can actually assist us with having access to renewable energy, to increase our livelihoods, for us to have energy, to light our homes, for us to have access to better healthcare services, but that is not supported. And let me also say that the knowledge that they hold, Sister Makoma spoke about the indigenous knowledge, the knowledge that comes from the people. It is often considered not knowledge, but that knowledge that communities are having is the knowledge that is making us drawn to their forests. Now we want their forests, and they have used that knowledge to sustain their forest resources, their rivers, their ecosystems. And let me just round off in saying that we cannot plant trees out of the climate crisis. The climate crisis needs a change in the whole system. It needs for us to start finding ways of how do we transform the system so that it can be able to sustain us. Yes, trees are part of what we need, but we need to transform our consumption habits, our consumption systems, and we need to find a development model that is driven by the communities, that is not extractivist in nature. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mala. You talk about the need for solutions that are not driven from the north, and you also emphasize knowledge and raise the question of whose knowledge is driving climate responses. And Makoma at the beginning reminded us that the climate crisis is a global one, and one that requires a world we have to share in common, and we have one planet. So there's a whole governance framework that then emerges around setting up priorities and responses for climate. I'd like to then bring in Dr. James Murombedzi to share with us what that governance framework looks like, and again, how do we center African priorities in those discussions and in those debates. For the first time, we had an Africa summit that took place in Nairobi. COP28 was in Dubai, and there's a lot of policy statements that were made around then. If you could just share with us what priority responses indeed look like that this community needs to coalesce around that really center African priorities. James.
Thank you, Masego, and thank you also, Makoma, for that framing presentation. And allow me to also acknowledge the organizers for bringing us here to share what I think is a very important conversation, but which has been constrained in terms of the interface between climate science and policy. But to respond to your question, Masego, in fact, we actually have to locate it within that science policy narrative. The first is to understand that the whole discourse around climate change is in fact framed by the science that is packaged by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. And I say packaged because IPCC does not in fact produce the science. The IPCC aggregates the science that is produced by individuals, institutions, and so on, who are working on this particular topic. And this is an important issue because, in fact, if you look at the IPCC assessment reports, and they are now into the 7th assessment cycle, each cycle takes about 5-6 years. And by the way, the IPCC was actually established by 2 Africans, right? A Nigerian professor who was head of the World Met Organization, and an Egyptian professor who was head of the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP. But for me, that's about the end of African involvement or influence in the IPCC. Because when you look at the IPCC assessment reports, they are reviewing all of the published research in refereed journals. The contributions that Africans have made since the first assessment report to the 6th assessment report amount to about 6% of the total IPCC assessment in 2 ways. The first is the number of African researchers that are being actually cited in those assessment reports. And most of those are, in fact, African researchers that are based in global North institutions than in African institutions. But the second is actually the amount of African research that is generated by Africans. So 6% includes research in Africa but carried out by non-Africans. So we can conclude from this that, in fact, what we know about the climate science largely in terms of research excludes African perspectives. But there's another way in which Africa is actually absent from the narrative, and this is geography. You talked in your introduction, Masego, about the intention of Paris being to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And we can discuss why a temperature goal and not why an emissions goal, because temperature is actually the symptom of a problem that is caused by emissions. But there's a reason for this. Anyway, Africa is probably already warmed by more than 2 degrees, while we are debating why we should keep warming below 2 degrees. And the reason for this is geographic, right? Africa has the largest land mass between the tropics. And much of what happens to the climate system is, in fact, influenced by events that happen in and around the equator. If you look at the map, the globe, you will not see that Africa is, in fact, the biggest continent. And that's largely because of the Mercator projection, which is designed to keep, north up and south down and so on. But you could actually fit the USA, North America, you could fit China, most of West Asia, and most of Western and Eastern Europe into Africa. So it's a massive landmass. And a lot that is happening between the tropics, in fact, is unknown, because there's very little investment in weather and climate observation system in Africa. Very little. In fact, the density of automated weather stations between the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn is actually less than the density of observation infrastructure in Greater London. So this is the second way in which, in fact, we know very little about what is actually happening with the climate system over Africa. And yet we are structuring policy responses that are responding or that are informed by narratives that don't speak to African realities, but also that determine Africa futures. These are just background observations that I would like to make in response to your question. Now, coming to your question about the responses themselves, what are they and what do they mean for Africa? Again, this is both a technical and a political question. Most of the climate response is, in fact, actually dominated by a need to maintain a growing capitalist economy. So most of the climate response is about investment in renewable energy, investment in new technologies, AI, all these different technologies in agriculture and so on. But in fact, very few of those investments, including the carbon markets, actually address the fundamental problem of slowing down emissions. If we take renewable energy for a moment, there have been massive increases in investments in solar and wind technologies. In 2023, it was up to about $1 billion a year in those technologies. Only 2% of that is coming to Africa. But most significantly, all of those investments are not in fact resulting or replacing fossil fuel energy. They are additional to fossil fuel energy. So they are happening at the same time that you also have increases in investments in fossil fuels. Now, this becomes a challenge for Africa because remember, Africa, as we have been debating the last 2 days, is faced with a decolonization issue beyond a decarbonization challenge. Now, the structural impacts of colonialism in Africa include deficits such as energy deficits that you mentioned, food deficits, and deficits in manufactured products. Africa will not close those gaps unless you invest heavily in industrialization. And with current renewable technologies, it is not possible to industrialize the continent. You actually need investments in fossil fuels, at least given existing technologies. And the Paris Agreement actually recognizes this. The Paris Agreement, Article 4 of the Paris Agreement, which provides for countries to develop and communicate nationally determined contributions, does say that countries can in fact increase, peak and plateau their emissions before declining them. But the agreement also provides for different rates of increase, peaking and decline for developed and developing countries. But the way in which the narrative has been incorporated into policy making in Africa has been that we should decarbonize immediately. And this presents a real developmental challenge for the continent at 2 levels. The first is there's very insufficient investment in technology or transfer of technology to enable the continent to actually even decline before peaking. And of course, the second is we have got very little emissions to decline anyway. So, for my thinking then, I think that we really need for our policies to be supported to respond firstly to African realities, but also to be able to have a presence in the global arenas in which the policies are made and agreed. And this comes to your observation about COP28, the Africa Climate Summit, and so on. You know, the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi, just before the summit, there was a huge movement by African civil society actually rejecting the agenda of the summit. And that was because the agenda had in fact actually been set outside of the continent. Nairobi was just the host of it. But the other thing is, you know, at the COPs, at the conferences of parties themselves, African representation is also constrained by several issues. The first is data. We've been discussing shortages of, limitations of data. And we can talk about limitations of data in the climate response itself, in addition to the climate observation systems, but also limited capacities to negotiate. You know, the negotiations are very complex processes. I've witnessed some of them, and you know, they are also very protracted as well. So we have challenges of very small delegations coming from Africa with little funding, little backup, and so on. But there are opportunities to increase our capacity. So that's one aspect of the response. If you'll allow me an additional minute to talk about, there is also a process in the Paris Agreement which allows for us to review the impacts of the implementation of climate response measures. It's called the KIC process, the Katowice Committee. What that does is, in fact, it actually recognizes that climate response measures themselves have negative or potentially negative impacts. And coming back to the decarbonization discussion we started, so decarbonization is not just about reducing emissions in production processes and so on. It's also about reducing emissions in trade in goods and services. So the European Union, the UK government are passing what they call carbon border adjustment legislation. What those mechanisms actually do is to say that the amount of carbon that is contained within goods and services that are imported into the UK or the European Union has to be limited, because that carbon could be counted as part of the emissions of those entities. Now, if in Africa we carry my argument, which is that we don't decarbonize immediately, that carries the risk that in fact the goods and services that we produce are not going to have access to those markets. And these are important goods and services. And in renewable energy, particularly the precursors that we are producing, right? Your lithium, your copper, your cobalt, and so on. Most of those are being exported to China and the European Union anyway. If we produce that with certain levels of emissions, very soon we will lose those markets. What does that mean for the development? The second set of regulations that is being developed globally are the deforestation regulations. Again, they are meant to limit the amount of deforestation emissions that are contained in agricultural goods and commodities. Now, put this side by side with the argument that Africa still has 60% of the world's remaining arable land. Most of that arable land is not currently utilized, but to utilize it, you have to deforest it, right? But if you deforest that land in order to export, to produce agricultural goods and services, you will not be able to export them because of deforestation. So these are just two climate responses. We can talk about many others which actually have potentially negative impacts for our own long-term economic and other development thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, James. Thank you, James. I think a very important reminder of the implications of the global climate response, and you actually take it even outside of the climate governance to talk about the new generation of trade policies and regulations that are threading through greening the value chain and what it means for various industries in the continent. You touch on a very controversial issue, which again takes me back to what Mema Goma was saying at the beginning, which is that decarbonization for Africa is complex and it's nuanced, and that industrialization is very important for growth and development going forward. And this is not possible to do it with renewables alone, right? And yet we also know that some of the strongest formations and social justice movements are actually pushing for the continent to think deeply about over-reliance on fossil fuels. And this is something that I think we need to unpack further. I wanted to turn to the audience before I come back to all of you with the last round of questions and see if I've got any questions in the audience for you.
Okay, just one comment about CBAM, which is a trade-related. Lots of people view it as a non-tariff trade barrier. So it's not really for the goodness of the environment. It's actually intended to, so I mean, some people view it as this, and there are lots of issues about it. Anyway, how do you finance, for example, the compensation for people affected, whether at the country level or at a individual level? There is a loss and damage mechanism, and it was actually suggested in the Paris Accord, and then in COP27, and then in COP28. And every time the amount of money they collect is pathetic. It's very little. And an interesting that happened is that developed countries threw in the way that part of the contribution should be based on your contribution to the damage. So there is an inherent issue there. There is an inherent issue that there is a global governance issue. When you look at the major pollutions now, after the Ukraine war, Germany converted to coal. Almost a big percentage of what their energy is coal. France started buying natural gas, which they used to buy from Russia. They started to buying it from Algeria, and with a bigger amount. Mm-hmm. We're not polluters. When you look at the way we have, we're not polluters. So whatever you do, you're not going to affect the big pie. So what we should be talking about, not how do you curtail emissions, but more of how do you help people or help economies, because there are lots of economies in
Thank you.
Africa that depends on fossil fuel.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to borrow Nozipo's words, that a good question is 10 words. Is that what it was? So please keep your questions very brief so that we can get to as many people as possible and then get back to the panelists. I had 2 questions at the back, and I'll take 3 questions this side and then get back to the panelists. 2 questions at the back.
Thanks. I just want to come back on a couple of points James made. I do think we need to take a firm stance against the carbon border adjustment mechanisms. But where do we begin? Because we know the COPs aren't delivering. I think we also know that the deforestation programs, the RED programs and so on, that are based on carbon credits are undermining our ability to remain resilient. We've got to be asking the questions for who are we protecting these forests for when we know they're critically important for
Great
whole
question.
sections.
Who are we protecting the forest for? Thank you for that.
And the final question is on decarbonisation, and this is a challenge because I think this is where the heart of the debate is.
Thank you.
Because
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you. I've got a number of hands in the room to get through.
Okay.
Yemi, and then I
You're
have
reducing
2
us to
hands
school
here.
children here.
Thank you.
To
I'm
questions.
sorry.
We got comments. We're activists working in the field. So I do think you're being a bit patronising. Thank you.
Yemi?
So, thanks. So I want to direct my question to James. When he's talking about governance, the UNFCCC mechanism or the convention model does not actually enable us to discuss the underlying causes of the problems that we're trying to confront. We are discussing not the underlying causes of climate change, but we are discussing the symptoms of climate change, and therefore we never actually get to the bottom and to address the problem in a sustainable way. So your comment, please, James. And then the issue of have we gone to war for energy? I think you should address that, because I think there have been wars around energy.
Thanks. You. I appreciate I'll take the sister here in the middle, and then the 2 hands I had. We'll come back for another round of questions.
Thank you very much. My name is Rosil Marandu-Kureithi from the Alan and Jill Gray Philanthropies. And to the panelists, amazing sharing. Thank you very much. My 2 questions very quickly are, we champion entrepreneurship for young people for social change, right? In what we are doing, and in this very important topic, what space have we left for young people to participate in that, in this area from an entrepreneurial perspective for social change? And secondly, a lot of our problems are based on the old way of doing things. The South for the North. I summarize it that way. In what ways are we changing our ways of doing to enhance South-to-South collaboration? Thank you.
Ahoy, my comrades. My name is Farai from Magamba Network here in Zimbabwe. Yeah, I think it's been an amazing presentation. I honestly think it's key that we have this awareness-raising campaign about the need for a just energy transition or a just transition, for that to be accompanied also by taking the fight to the big polluters on the continent, the big fossil fuel corporations who are heating up our continent, like Total, Eni, Exxon, and so forth. But I think the question I want to ask is what really interests me as a creative and an activist, is how do we take this really out of the NGO space, out of academic language, out of NGO-y language? How do we build campaigns that speak in indigenous languages, that connect with local communities, that connect with young Africans, make the struggle for climate justice sexy because we're putting out creative digital content, we're putting out music, So yeah, my question is that how do we really connect with African audiences where they're at in languages that resonate with them?
Thank you. Bobby, I'll take the last question.
Hi, I'm Bobby Peake from South Africa, from Groundwork Friends of the Earth, South Africa. James, thank you very much. I mean, finally somebody who's linked to the UN has said to us that actually the UNFCCC is protecting capitalist markets rather than dealing with climate change. So I think that's really important to recognize. The UNFCCC is protecting capital markets and not people. So the question I have for the panel here and for everybody in the room, I don't care about CBAM. I don't want to trade with Europe. Why don't we trade with each other? What is the trading mechanism within Africa that allows us to use our lithium for Africa, for the people of Africa, rather than for the US, Europe, and China? And by the way, we also have to stand in solidarity with those people in China who are suffering at the dirty end of Chinese production.
Thank you. Lots of questions. A lot of questions ranging from how we create space, a more inclusive space outside the NGOs. I won't repeat them in order to save time, but I will invite Mela, maybe you can take some and hand over to Ikal, James, and we'll end up with Memakoma. And we will still have time for 2 or 3 more questions at the end.
Thank you very much. I want to start with the question of where do we start? Where do we begin? I think where we have to start is with the people, because we have failed ourselves, because we have rejected our own ways of knowing, our own economies that are based on solidarity, that are based on care. And we have actually kind of looked down upon care. And also we have internalized so much of the dominant ways of knowing, the dominant ideologies. And let me just say, as Shine, the work that we are doing is so rooted in the movements. We are working in Malawi, and in Malawi, we are actually building on the Our Bodies, Our Lives movement. Some of the people in this room, like Lisa, like Wadzanai here, they know this movement. This is a movement that was started by women fighting for bodily autonomy, fighting for other rights, but we do not see the issues of energy justice as separate from all these other rights that women are working on. And let me just give you an example. When I went to Malawi, soon after the cyclone Freddy, one of the women said to me, hey, sister, what you are bringing to us and what we are discussing here, if we had just, had energy, just energy for us to be able to charge our phones, maybe we would have known about Cyclone Freddy before it hits. Maybe we could have left our homes. Maybe some of the people that perished could have survived. And you see how the climate crisis is not disconnected from everything else. And when sometimes we engage with communities here in Zimbabwe, last time there was a campaign on, women's participation in politics, women's participation in decision-making processes. And one of the elderly women that were sitting with said to me, I wake up at 4 and I have to do a lot of work in the fields. I have to go to the market. I don't have time to go and participate in a meeting. And not because I don't want, but because I'm very tired, because I'm using sources of energy that consume a lot of time. And therefore, when we are talking about the issues of energy justice, we are talking about the issues of distribution of the energy that we have, the issues of the whole value chain of the energy system, who is paying the cost for all that. And most of the time, these are people who are very vulnerable in a lot of ways, having intersecting identities that place them in a situation where they are unable to voice, they have no voice, and their lives are reduced to getting firewood, doing all this work that can be done in a much better way if they had access to energy. And this energy also being one of the enablers of gender equality, but not only that, as a way of addressing the climate crisis itself. Let us just think of, these are just very small examples, but in a sea of so many, about how, as Gamchirai said yesterday in one of the side events, that we are sitting with a very devastating drought in Southern Africa. What would it mean if communities had access to solar-powered systems that can enable them to water their gardens?
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. We'll keep the thread of how as we go down to Ikal and James, and I'll come back to Makoma.
All right, I'll try and be quick. I think for me, for Professor Ali, I think the question is whose value is being used for the compensation? We seem to always say compensation, but whose value? Is it a market value? No one values our culture, our identity, and belonging to the land. So I think we need to work on that, because we keep saying compensation, but everybody else comes to compensate us on our lands. So that is the big question. Just to answer on the entrepreneurial, we are pushing for community-led solutions, and supported by my sister here, Masego, because in Kenya, there is a young man who's built up an energy system that he's supplying to his entire community, which then starts to talk about decentralization of energy, because if we keep using the decentralized systems, that's why it's expensive. But we need to talk about what does decentralization of energy look like, so that you see communities who are able to generate energy that they can use, they can actually start to dictate what is the energy for? If it is to preserve the food, they can come up with cooperative systems. Let's go back to what built us from where we were. But the last one, I think, is to look at when you're talking about how. Last year, when the governments were having the Africa Climate Summit, we had the People's Assembly. And this was a space where we were linking rural people living in rural spaces and urban informal settlements to talk about their struggles with climate. Because people talk about climate as if it's an issue of farms and production, but urban communities are having this issue. And we had a lot of music and dance. We communicated it for Africans by Africans, and so that's why we called it the People's Assembly. And really finding new ways to talk about the issues that are affecting people, food, that there are people who are doing growers, and the link between debt and, but lastly, it's to link this conversation. We are having a discussion on climate, but we've already delinked it from the economic issues. So organizations who have been funding debt, so if you're talking about climate debt, so that the people who've been working on debt can understand what does climate debt look like? What is the economic justice and the climate justice conversations? How do we link the different conversations around the people of Africa so that we make sense for Africa?
Thank you. James?
Yeah, thank you. So starting with your comment, Masego, that is it possible to decarbonize with renewables alone? I think the real question is, is it possible to decarbonize a system that is not decolonized? Because when you look at the property relations, the ways in which these carbon resources are actually moving in different economic systems, it is actually just an extension of the relationships of inequality between developed and in developing countries. I think I agree with the question about the challenges of addressing loss and damage are really challenges about valuation. What values, what is being compensated, what kind of losses and damages. And we don't yet have a system that actually speaks to and so it's difficult to operationalize the loss and damage which was recently set up. And I also agree with the comment about, initiatives that are nature-based, such as forest management and so on, being initiatives that actually benefit the polluters because they create more spaces for. In fact, there's a very cynical way in which carbon markets operate, for instance. And we need to recognize this and actually begin to challenge our policymakers. And it is that when you sell a carbon credit, let's say a ton of carbon, to a polluter, you also, in return, you have to record the emissions from that polluter as your own emissions. This is called complementary adjustment, right? So that comparative adjustment actually means Africa is going to be very soon importing huge amounts of emissions without emitting anything and getting very limited. I mean, the biggest amount of money we have been able to get per ton of carbon so far is around $7 per ton. If you compare that with the European trading system, carbon there costs somewhere around $80, $120 per ton. So we are underselling ourselves, and many of these agreements are for long periods of time, like 45 years. So, you know, we have to really look at this critically and actually address. Do I still have time? Because Yemi also asked some important questions about the convention model not enabling us to address the underlying problem. The underlying challenge being, in fact, emissions, but also emissions structured in a certain way. And this is where my point about the convention, in fact, actually was designed to limit emissions, but the convention is not binding. And the legal instruments which were created in order to have commitments were firstly the Kyoto Protocol. And if you look at it, the Kyoto Protocol, in fact, actually is focusing on emissions because it allocates responsibilities for Annex 1, non-Annex countries to limit their emissions. And that quickly ran into problems, political economy problems, where initial Annex 1 countries were those developed advanced economies, made the argument that, in fact, emerging economies, China, Russia, Indonesia, and so on, were beginning to emit much more than themselves, which is true, right? But it is true only in the contemporary sense. They are not responsible for historical concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but they are currently emitting much more than historically developed countries. So in order to resolve that contestation between emerging and advanced economies, the Paris Agreement then comes into being. And the key difference between Paris and Kyoto is that the Paris Agreement says everyone, including developing countries, needs to put together climate actions contained in our nationally determined commitments. And so the Paris Agreement has actually moved for sure from addressing the origin of the problem to addressing the symptom, which is contained in the temperature goal.
James, I see you're avoiding eye contact with me, so I don't stop you. But I'm going to stop you and hold that thought because I'm going to come back to all of you with your key takeaway messages after I take 2 questions, 3 at the most from the audience. Memakom.
Thank you for the questions and the comments. I think the underlying causes of climate change have been challenged and people are working around that on an everyday basis. One is that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its assessment reports has actually indicated that coal is a major contributor towards global warming or increasing of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And the examples that I would make is that the people of Lamu in Kenya challenged a coal-fired power station, and in South Africa, I think we have one victory in that the World Bank, the last project on coal that they would be funding was in South Africa, that was Eskom Medupi. And we also have reversed, we also have challenged the construction of coal-fired power stations. One was Tabamedzi, which we linked to the climate change impact of the plant for its lifespan. And in the Mpumalanga area, where Groundwork Friends of the Earth work mostly, there were a number of independent power producers, coal-independent power producers that just fell off. So the challenge is there. People are doing that on an everyday basis. There has been wars that are fought around energy, and we're experiencing them today. When I started speaking, which I normally do, just to bring people to realize as to what we're going through, if every minute we are together, a person dies because of pollution, it is a war, because count the number of minutes in a day, count the number of minutes in years and years and years, how many people have died. So the wars are being fought, they are silent, it's just that they don't have guns, unlike the wars in the Middle East around Iraq. Remember in the early 2000s, the war in Iraq, what was the basis for that war? It was on oil. So it was an energy war. And we have a situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo where continuously people are maimed and killed because of either minerals and oil, and we know that that country is very rich in all kinds of minerals. So the wars are there, and it's up to us to stand up. It's up to us to say no to all of this. You should not put a blind eye when somebody dies. We need to know what is the situation, particularly people who are living around the mining areas, people who find themselves vulnerable to climate change-induced natural disasters. That is something that we need to stand up to, so the wars have been there. And there was a question around how do we take this whole conversation out of NGOs? I think one thing is within the communities that we live in, there's a number of traditional or cultural gatherings that we have. This is where we start. This is where we start talking, and this is where people gather and share much more information. This is not an NGO project. This is a project about our survival, about how do we live. And that is why it is important that I mentioned that we need to learn a lot from our ancient wisdoms, because they are the ones where we can learn on how to adapt today. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take 3 questions and then we will wrap up. And I hope that the organizers can see that for the next session, you need a whole day to discuss climate. I'll take 1 question from this side. The gentleman right at the back of the room has had his hand up for a very long time, and I'll take 2 questions here and come back to the panel.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Kumbulani Maposa. I'm based here in Zimbabwe, and I'm with Africa Forum for Development Induced Displacements. Thank you, Ikal, for raising a critical issue of land and the local communities affected by renewable energy. My question then to you is, how best can we secure the voice and agency of minority, ethnic, linguistic, and indigenous communities in rural areas who are affected and being displaced by just energy projects in the context of rising autocracy and democratic backsliding, where majoritarianism is the indicator of democracy? Thank you.
Nancy and the gentleman in front of you.
Thank you so much for the presentations and for all the work you've been doing at the front lines in this struggle. We've been following you and you've been raising awareness, Mela, Ikal, and Makoma, and Masego. Can you give us a business as usual in 10 years scenario? What do we need to get ready for? Do we get bunkers? I don't know. Because if nothing is being done and things are that bad, maybe we need to be sort of saying, what do we need to be ready for? I know the IPCC does some of those reports, but it comes a bit abstract. So maybe what do we prepare ourselves for?
It's a big question.
Okay. Great question. My name is Andrea Curreri. I work for the Good Shepherd International Foundation, and we have actually a program in the DRC Congo, Katanga, Kolwezi, where 80% of the cobalt is extracted. So my question is really around just transition and green resourcing. This green resourcing comes with major, massive human rights violation, and we experience this every day. And just listening what Mama said now about all the people dying on the mines and major health disease. So my question is, we are the only, in the region of Kolwezi, the only organization doing something at the grassroots level, providing services for the people that are in the artisanal mining community. Why, first question, why no one else is present, or maybe not present in the service delivery? And secondly, how can we do, as a philanthropist collectively, something about this major human rights violation in the extractive system, supply chain of the cobalt, especially, and other minerals? Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Please weave those 3 questions into your responses, and if you could just, I don't want to be a reductionist, but I'd really love for you to think about what your key takeaway message for us is, and essentially how African philanthropists can engage in this issue with the priorities that you have highlighted, as well as how African philanthropists can collaborate with global funders that are funding a lot of the NGO formations and some of the government responses. What does that meaningful funding from philanthropy look like so that we get to that heart of pushing the next frontiers of philanthropy? And I will start with Mela, Ikal, James, and end with our keynote speaker.
Thank you very much. Nancy spoke about what we have to prepare for. Let me just say we are being very hopeful that we are going to work on an energy transition starting now. If we haven't started, that centers justice in the real sense, that it does not reproduce the former unjust fossil fuels driven development, that we do not only change the technologies, but we also change in terms of ensuring gender equality, we ensure climate justice, we ensure other justices in the process of changing. And Andrea asked the question of why is there no one? I feel there is so much, I don't want to call it not knowing, but there is so much detachment, being detached from what is going on within the philanthropy and the people who are affected and the NGOs. I feel there is need for us to have a community of practice, a community of learning from each other, of knowing, which includes philanthropies, which brings in all these sectors which often do not speak to each other in the same room with the community-based organizations, and getting to know what needs to be done, what needs to be funded, what needs, what should development justice look like. And we are very hopeful that the work, because we cannot say we are not going to be involved in the just transition as Africa, because the minerals are coming from Africa and we are already there. And therefore, let us push for a transition that includes even the people in the informal sector. We acknowledge that the just energy transition came from the unions, but now we see how it is affecting communities that are hosting the critical minerals, how it is severely affecting people, and particularly women in the informal sector.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mela. Thank you, Mela.
To answer the question, but also just to respond fully, I think the biggest need for us is constituency building. And really is building constituency in terms of not, because people who are in the mine spaces were farmers, they're looking for water. So it's really building constituency across the continent and trying to, many years ago when I was getting into this work, there was a lot of support, Tadenos, there's a lot of support into cross-learning and peer learning, and now it's very reduced. I think more funders are finding it's you work in your space. I think the philanthropy is actually a bad thing in its own way, because it fragments the movement instead of thinking around how do people leaving this struggle learn from each other. And so we've got to put more money into that. And I think the last one is an ecosystem approach. Again, as I said, climate is not in a vacuum. It's happening, it's a political conversation, it's an economic conversation, it's a survival conversation, it's a dignity conversation, it's a GBV conversation. So how do we look at it from an ecosystem approach and really try and link the different pieces together? And I think the convening power that philanthropy has is critical to support these processes, like how they brought Abebe from AI. Alvin and I said we need a masterclass on understanding AI within the space of work of economic justice, climate justice, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with the comments of the two ladies. But if you'll allow me to speak. Yeah, so firstly, I think Makoma made a very important point about the Medupi coal power plant in South Africa. It brings in something that we didn't discuss, which is the potential for stranded assets. You know, Medupi was the biggest loan ever made by the World Bank. It cost something around $9 billion, was concluded only in 2018. If we transition out of coal, how is South Africa going to pay? So it becomes a huge asset which is stranded, which we cannot use, but it's a conversation we need to have. So now responding to your question, Masego, yes, I think one of the biggest challenges that we have in the climate conversation is the absence of the African narrative. So yes, how do we build the African constituency? How do we support research? And in fact, you know, Codesria actually has a model, a brilliant model, where an Africa-wide research program was actually supported for several years, and he has actually produced one of the most significant contributions by African researchers to the IPCC process. If organizations like Codesria could get resources from African philanthropy to continue that model and to scale it out and scale it up. Thank you.
I wish that we could have had a climate convention now. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like this is something we're going to achieve. It's not around the corner, and it is based on what is being put out there. I think in the past 3 COPs, we've heard how countries have been saying in their nationally, or 2 years, in their nationally determined contributions, they are looking towards net zero 2050, and that is an indication that we're not going to have any climate convention very soon. However, I think we should have prepared ourselves long ago. This is where we need to start preparing ourselves of the climate change-induced natural disasters that already we are experiencing. Let's learn the architecture that our forefathers used. It was such that it could be climate resilient. When the strong winds, when there's flooding, the houses didn't have like foundations that we have. They were lifted on top, and the idea was that it's for crawling animals to pass under, but also that was a climate resilient. And the cone-shaped houses, that was for like when there's winds, strong winds blowing. So there's a number of things that we can learn, and in our preparation, I think that's what we need to go back to. How do we preserve our food? That is something that is seen as something very small to other people, but when disaster struck, this is what we always need. My call, or my last call to philanthropists, is to support the decentralized energy systems, socially owned, that people are actually initiating and others have started already. In South Africa, we, together with community-based organization, we're starting what we call the Just Transition Centers. Those Just Transition Centers are going to showcase how renewable energy technologies work within a particular area. And also, those Just Transition Centers will showcase, will work as an educational center, as where people can converge and discuss and plan, and also prepare for what they don't know may become of the future. But in the spirit of Ubuntu, Ukama, and Sankofa, I would want us to say, let's learn let's be together. Let's act in solidarity and not repeat the mistakes of the past, only take the positive, the progressive from the past, and that's how we can build a better world for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. There we have it. Climate change is not a niche issue. It is our issue. It requires collective action, a collective response. I think we've had the need for the research community to get involved, the need for African philanthropy to get involved, the NGOs, the social movements, and for us to actually make sure that we are grounding the responses and centering the realities of the local communities on the front lines. And with that, I'd like for you to give a huge round of applause to the speakers.